My name is Alara Bennett, a 30-year-old estate archivist who grew up learning that my place in the family was to preserve everyone else's history while quietly disappearing from it myself. My younger brother, Caleb Bennett, was the golden child Mom polished for every room and Dad defended in every failure, while my work was absorbed into the background and my worth measured only by how useful I could be to them. Mom curated affection like a performance and Dad enforced it like policy, praising Caleb's smallest efforts as brilliance while treating my years of loyalty, sacrifice, and responsibility as something expected and therefore invisible. And the moment I stepped into my grandmother's funeral and saw the tribute I had written displayed without my name, replaced by a version that credited only Mom, Dad, and Caleb, I understood they had erased me deliberately in front of everyone we knew. The funeral home stood on a quiet street just outside downtown Columbus, its windows dimmed by overcast light and its entrance framed with arrangements I had personally ordered 3 days earlier, down to the ribbon color. My grandmother once said reminded her of late autumn afternoons. As I crossed the damp pavement with my coat pulled close, I could already hear the softened murmur of arriving guests, the kind of careful voices people use when grief is expected but not fully felt, and I realized with a strange clarity that everything inside had been arranged exactly as I had planned. Except for one detail that would rewrite the entire meaning of the day. I had spent the last week managing every aspect of this funeral, while Mom answered calls selectively, and Dad positioned himself as the composed center of the family, repeating to anyone who would listen that Caleb had flown in from Seattle, despite his schedule, as if inconvenience alone defined devotion. I had chosen the music, coordinated with the pastor, organized the viewing order, printed the programs, and stayed up until nearly 2 in the morning refining the tribute text. Mom claimed she was too emotional to write, even though her voice had been steady and controlled when she handed the responsibility to me without hesitation. Inside the foyer, the air carried a blend of lilies and polished wood, and a volunteer greeted me with quiet professionalism, unaware that I was not simply a grieving granddaughter but the one who had built this entire ceremony piece by piece. My eyes moved immediately toward the memorial display near the chapel entrance, drawn by the photographs I had selected and arranged in careful sequence, each one chosen to reflect a version of my grandmother that no one else had taken the time to truly see. I stopped when I reached the tribute frame beneath the photos, my gaze locking onto the printed paragraph I knew almost word for word. Except now it ended differently. The final line listing only Mom, Dad, and Caleb as her surviving family, as if I had never existed within the same bloodline I had spent my entire life supporting. For a moment, I thought I had missed something, that perhaps my name had been shortened or misplaced. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became that this was not an oversight but a decision, precise and intentional. I felt something inside me shift. Not break. Shift. Lena Lara, there you are. Mom's voice came from behind me, warm and composed for anyone within earshot, as though she had not just removed me from the narrative of our own family. I turned slowly, meeting her gaze, and saw the practiced calm she wore in public, the kind that never wavered unless someone threatened to expose what lay beneath it. My name isn't on the tribute, I said quietly, keeping my voice steady, because I had learned long ago that control unsettled them more than anger ever could. Mom stepped closer, her hand brushing my arm in a gesture that looked gentle but felt calculated, her eyes flicking briefly toward the guests nearby, before settling back on me. "This is not the time," she murmured, her tone low but firm, shaped by years of knowing exactly how to redirect a situation without appearing responsible for it. "Your grandmother would not want a scene today." The words landed with familiar precision, not because they were new, but because they were exactly the kind of justification she had always used when something needed to be silenced rather than addressed. Before I could respond, Caleb appeared from the side hallway, adjusting his tie with one hand and holding a coffee cup in the other, his presence immediately altering the space around him in the way it always had. He glanced at the display, then at me, and gave a small, dismissive smile, the kind that suggested the issue was already understood and not worth discussing further. "Don't start this here," he said, his voice low enough to seem reasonable, but edged with the quiet authority of someone who had never once been challenged without consequence shifting away from him. I held his gaze for a second longer than expected, not reacting, not stepping back, simply allowing the weight of the moment to settle between us in a way it never had before. Dad joined us moments later, his expression already tightened into quiet disapproval, as though he had been informed just enough to take a position without needing to understand the details. He looked at me, then at the tribute, and then back at me again, his posture signaling that whatever this was, it needed to end quickly and without disruption. "Lenora," he said, his voice controlled but unmistakably firm, "we are here to honor your grandmother, not to create unnecessary problems." Unnecessary. The word echoed in my mind, not as an insult, but as confirmation of something I had spent years trying not to fully accept. I looked back at the tribute, at the words I had written, now stripped of my presence, and then at the three of them standing together, aligned not just in position but in certainty, completely confident that I would adjust, as I always had. And for the first time in my life I didn't. The chapel doors had not even closed yet when Mom's fingers tightened slightly on my sleeve, guiding me a step away from the display with a softness that would look like care to anyone watching, but felt like control to me in a way I could no longer ignore. Her smile remained perfectly measured for the guests filtering past us, her voice lowered just enough to sound intimate without drawing attention, as she leaned closer and said that we would discuss everything later, after the service, after the reception, after the day had passed cleanly enough for no one to question the version of the family she had already presented. I did not move with her immediately. And that hesitation, brief as it was, caused something to flicker across her face. A small disruption in the calm she depended on to manage every situation, especially the ones she had created herself. Dad stepped in closer. Not aggressively, but with that quiet authority he had always used when he expected compliance without resistance. And he reminded me in a low, even tone that today was not about me, that grief required discipline, and that any personal feelings I had could wait until we were no longer being observed. Caleb exhaled softly beside him, adjusting his cuff as if the entire situation were a minor inconvenience, interrupting a schedule he considered more important. And he added that I was overthinking something simple, that Mom had only streamlined the tribute to keep it focused, that it was not personal unless I decided to make it personal. His words carried the same pattern I had heard my entire life. A careful reframing that turned exclusion into efficiency, dismissal into practicality, and harm into something so ordinary it barely deserved acknowledgement. I felt the familiar pressure building around me, not loud or chaotic, but precise, layered, and practiced, the kind of pressure that does not force you outright, but instead narrows your choices until silence feels like the only reasonable response. It was the same pressure that had convinced me to give up opportunities, to absorb blame, to rewrite my own experiences in ways that made everyone else more comfortable, and as I stood there between them, I realized with a clarity that unsettled even me, that they were not asking me to understand what had happened. They were asking me to accept it without question. "After the service?" Mom repeated, her voice still soft, still controlled, but now carrying a subtle edge that only I would recognize, because I had been trained to hear it. "We can fix whatever you think is wrong." Whatever I think is wrong. The phrasing settled into me slowly, because it was not just dismissive, it was strategic, a way of reducing something real into something subjective, something that could be corrected not by changing the truth, but by changing my reaction to it. Dad gave a small nod, reinforcing her position without needing to repeat it. And Caleb glanced toward the chapel doors as if the timing of this conversation mattered more than its content. I looked at each of them in turn, not searching for empathy anymore, not expecting recognition, but observing them with a distance I had never allowed myself before. And what I saw was not confusion or regret, but alignment. They had already agreed on the narrative, already decided what this moment meant, and more importantly, what it did not mean. And for the first time, I understood that this was not a misunderstanding to be resolved later, but a pattern being enforced in real time. A choice. I felt my grip tighten around the folded funeral program in my hand, the edges pressing into my palm in a way that grounded me more than anything they were saying. And I realized that every detail of this day, every arrangement, every word printed on that tribute, had passed through me before it ever reached them. I knew where the original files were stored. I knew what had been submitted to the printer. And I knew exactly how the version displayed in front of the guests had been altered after I had completed my work. "Did you change it after I sent the final draft?" I asked, my voice still calm, still even, but now carrying a weight that made all three of them pause, just for a fraction of a second. Mom did not answer immediately, which in our family meant she was calculating, measuring the response that would preserve the most control with the least visible damage. "We made a few adjustments," she said finally, her tone careful, as if precision could soften impact. It was a collaborative effort. Collaborative. I almost smiled at the word, not because it was amusing, but because it revealed more than she intended. And in that moment I realized that they were not concerned about whether I knew what had happened. They were concerned about whether I would say it out loud. Dad shifted his stance slightly, stepping closer in a way that blocked part of the view from the foyer, creating a small pocket of privacy that allowed him to speak more directly without risking attention. "Lenora," he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "This is not something we are going to debate today." There it was. Not denial. Not explanation. Closure. Final, controlled, and already decided. Caleb checked his watch, exhaling again, his patience thinning in a way he did not bother to hide anymore, and he added that people were already taking their seats, that the pastor was waiting, that this needed to end now. His version of urgency had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with maintaining the schedule he believed the world should follow. I let the silence stretch for a second longer than expected, not out of hesitation, but because I was choosing my next step with a level of awareness I had never applied before. And in that space, something shifted inside me again. Deeper this time, quieter, but far more permanent. They were not going to fix this. They were going to bury it. With her. And they expected me to help. I lifted my gaze from the program to the chapel doors, where guests were beginning to file inside, their faces composed, their voices lowered, unaware of the fracture standing just a few feet away from them, and I realized that everything about this moment had been designed to keep me contained, to ensure that whatever I felt would remain invisible long enough for their version of the story to settle into place. I looked back at Mom, then Dad, then Caleb, and instead of stepping forward with them toward the chapel, I stayed exactly where I was. The first chord of the opening hymn drifted out from the chapel just as the last few guests slipped through the doors, and the sound carried a kind of measured calm that contrasted sharply with the stillness I had chosen to hold in the foyer. I could feel Mom's attention sharpen beside me, not because I had spoken, but because I had not moved, and in our family, stillness had always been more threatening than resistance, because it meant I was no longer responding on instinct. "Lenora," Dad said quietly, his tone shifting from controlled authority to something more pointed, as if he were reminding me of a rule I was expected to remember without being told twice, and I could hear the impatience beneath it, the subtle expectation that I would correct myself before he had to escalate. Caleb glanced toward the chapel again, then back at me, and for the first time there was a hint of irritation that went beyond inconvenience, because my refusal to follow the rhythm of the moment disrupted more than just timing. I stepped past them without answering, not toward the chapel, but back toward the memorial display. And I felt their attention follow me immediately, the quiet gravity of their expectation breaking just enough to create space for something new. The board stood exactly where it had been, untouched, composed, complete in the version of the story they had approved. And as I reached out to lift the framed tribute from its stand, I heard Mom's voice behind me, sharper now, stripped of its public softness. "What are you doing?" The question was not curious. It was a warning. I turned the frame in my hands, feeling the smooth edge of the glass against my fingers, and for a brief second I saw my own reflection layered faintly over the printed words beneath it. A ghost inside someone else's narrative, and I realized how easily that could have remained my position if I had walked into the chapel when they told me to. "I'm fixing it," I said, my voice steady. Not raised, not dramatic, just clear enough that it carried through the quiet foyer. Dad took a step forward, his expression tightening in a way that signaled he was no longer trying to manage perception but control outcome. And he lowered his voice again. though the restraint in it had thinned. "Put that back," he said, each word deliberate, as if saying it slower would make it easier for me to obey. "This is not the place for whatever you think you're doing." Caleb exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, the first visible crack in the composure he liked to maintain, and he moved closer, positioning himself slightly between me and the chapel entrance, as though he could physically contain what he had never needed to confront before. "You're going to make this worse," he said, his tone no longer dismissive but edged with frustration, because for once he could not predict how I would respond. I looked at him, then at Dad, then at Mom, and what struck me most was not their anger, but their certainty, the quiet, unshaken belief that this moment would resolve the same way every other moment had, with me adjusting, yielding, stepping back into the role they had assigned me, long before I understood what it cost. But something had already changed. I reached into my bag with my free hand and pulled out a folded copy of the original tribute, the one I had printed for proofing the night before sending it to Mom, the one that still carried my full name at the end, not as an afterthought, but as part of the truth. The paper was slightly creased from being carried, but the ink was sharp, the wording intact, and for a second I simply held it there, between us, not presenting it yet, just letting the weight of its existence settle into the space. Mom's eyes moved to it immediately, and I saw the exact moment she understood what it meant. Not just that I had the original, but that I had chosen to bring it with me. "You don't need to do this," she said, and the softness in her voice returned. But it was different now, thinner, more urgent, because it was no longer about guiding me, it was about stopping me. "I already did," I replied, and this time I did not lower my voice. The words did not echo. They didn't need to. A couple near the entrance slowed slightly as they passed. Not stopping, not turning fully, but aware enough to register that something was happening just outside the carefully managed boundaries of the service. Dad's jaw tightened, his posture shifting again, and he stepped closer, close enough that his voice dropped to a level only we could hear. "You are not going to embarrass this family today," he said. And there it was, the real priority, not grief, not memory, not truth, but image. I met his gaze without flinching. Not because I was trying to challenge him, but because for the first time I was no longer trying to protect him either. "I'm not the one who erased someone from her own grandmother's tribute," I said quietly. The sentence landed. Caleb looked away first, not out of guilt, but out of discomfort, the kind that comes when something undeniable enters the room and refuses to be reframed. Mom inhaled slowly, her composure tightening around her like armor, and for a brief second, the entire structure they had built around this moment felt less solid than it had a minute ago. Inside the chapel, the hymn ended, and the pastor's voice began, steady and practiced, welcoming everyone, speaking about remembrance, about honoring a life, about truth told through memory. Truth. The word echoed faintly through the open doors, and it felt almost ironic, almost deliberate, as if the timing itself had aligned with something none of them had planned for. I looked down at the tribute frame in my hands, then at the original copy I was holding, and then back toward the chapel, where rows of people sat ready to listen, ready to accept whatever version of the story they were given. And for the first time, I understood that silence would not just protect them, it would erase me. I stepped forward, not toward my family but toward the chapel doors, and I didn't stop. The first bill arrived 3 days after the funeral. A plain white envelope slipped under my apartment door with a quiet finality that made everything I had avoided thinking about suddenly unavoidable. I sat at the small kitchen table, still in the same black sweater I had worn too many days in a row, and opened it slowly, already knowing the number would not change, based on how carefully I unfolded the paper. And when I saw the total due $1,842, including late penalties I had not tracked, I felt a sharp, immediate pressure settle into my chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with survival. My bank account showed $2,316. The difference between those two numbers became the most honest measure of my life in that moment, because it stripped away every illusion I had been raised to maintain and replaced it with something exact, something that could not be negotiated with politeness or avoided with silence. Rent was due in 11 days. My freelance invoices were still pending approval, and for the first time in my life, there was no invisible safety net woven through my family's expectations, no quiet bailout disguised as generosity, no phone call I could make without stepping back into the system I had just walked away from. I closed my laptop, stood up, and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot below as if distance could reorganize the numbers into something more manageable. But nothing shifted. Nothing softened. And that was when I understood that independence was not a feeling, it was a calculation. And I was running out of time. The next 48 hours were not reflective or cinematic in the way I had once imagined hardship would be, but precise, exhausting, and relentlessly practical, filled with decisions that carried immediate consequences if I made them incorrectly. I reviewed every open project I had, every client email, every draft I had left unfinished, and I identified the one opportunity that had seemed too demanding to accept just a week earlier: a full estate reconstruction for a private legal firm handling a contested inheritance case that required 6 months of archived records to be verified, cross-referenced, and digitized within 10 days. The pay was $9,500. The timeline was brutal. The margin for error was non-existent. I opened the email again, reread the conditions, and felt the familiar hesitation rise. The instinct to step back, to question whether I was ready, whether I could handle something at that scale alone. But then I thought about the tribute board, the clean absence of my name, the quiet certainty my family had in my willingness to shrink, and I realized that hesitation was a habit I could no longer afford. I accepted the contract. The work began that night. Boxes of documents were delivered the next morning, stacked in uneven towers across my living room, each one filled with decades of records that had been handled carelessly by people who assumed someone else would eventually fix what they had neglected. Birth certificates with inconsistent dates, handwritten property transfers, unsigned amendments, mislabeled folders, and missing pages that required reconstruction through secondary references. All of it layered with legal urgency that left no room for delay or uncertainty. I worked 18 hours that first day, stopping only to drink water and reread sections that did not align, building a system from scratch because there was no time to design one properly, only to make it function. My back ached, my eyes burned, and at some point in the early morning, I realized I had not spoken out loud to another person in nearly 24 hours. But the silence no longer felt empty, it felt focused. By the third day, I had mapped the entire archive. By the fifth, I had identified 3 discrepancies that altered the structure of the inheritance case entirely, inconsistencies that had gone unnoticed for years, because no one had taken the time to look beyond surface documentation. I documented everything, cross-referenced each finding, and sent a preliminary report to the firm with annotations detailed enough to support legal review, expecting a standard acknowledgement, something procedural and distant. Instead, I received a call. The senior partner spoke slowly, deliberately, the way people do when they are recalibrating their expectations in real time. And he asked me to walk him through the discrepancies step by step, not because he doubted them, but because he needed to understand how I had found them so quickly. I explained my process, my indexing method, the way I tracked inconsistencies across fragmented records. And when I finished, there was a pause on the line that stretched just long enough to carry meaning. "We've had 3 analysts look at this," he said finally, his tone no longer neutral. "You found what they missed in less than a week." The words settled into me differently than any praise I had received before. Not because they were louder or more emotional, but because they were precise, grounded in something measurable, something real. By the 7th day, the firm extended the contract, increasing the total value to $18,000 and requesting that I remain on the case through its resolution, not as support, but as lead archival consultant, a title I had never been given before because I had never been in a position where someone needed to recognize what I was capable of without filtering it through someone else's expectations. I transferred the first payment into my account that afternoon. $6,000 cleared within hours. I sat at the same kitchen table where I had opened the overdue bill just days earlier, refreshed my banking app, and watched the balance adjust in a way that felt less like relief and more like recalibration, as if the numbers themselves were confirming something I had only begun to understand. I was not struggling because I was incapable. I had been limited because I was contained. The apartment still looked the same. The stacks of documents still covered half the room, and my body still carried the exhaustion of days spent working beyond what felt sustainable. But something fundamental had shifted beneath all of it. Something quiet and unshakable. For the first time in my life, what I built did not disappear behind someone else's name, and I did not need permission to keep going. The first time my name appeared on a formal case summary, it was not announced, not celebrated, and not shared with anyone outside the legal team. But it was there in clean, unambiguous text. Lead Archival Consultant Ilara Bennett. I stared at the document longer than necessary, not because I doubted it, but because I had spent so many years watching my work pass through other people's hands that seeing it attached to my own identity felt unfamiliar in a way I had to consciously accept. The firm moved quickly after that. What had started as a single high-pressure contract expanded into a sequence of referrals, each one more complex than the last, each one requiring a level of precision and trust that could not be delegated to someone who merely followed instructions. Estate disputes, missing asset trails, contested ownership records, layered documentation spanning decades, all of it arriving with urgency and expectation. And for the first time, I was not the person quietly supporting the process, I was the one defining it. Within 6 weeks, I had closed 3 major cases. The total earnings crossed $42,000. But the numbers, while significant, were not the most important shift. It was the control. I set my own timelines, structured my own systems, and determined how each case would be handled. Not because someone had granted me authority, but because I had proven, through work that could not be ignored, that I already operated at that level. Clients began requesting me directly, not through referrals alone but by name, and each time I saw it in an email subject line or heard it in a call, it reinforced something that had never been allowed to take root before. I was not replaceable. The apartment changed gradually. The stacks of documents disappeared, replaced by a more deliberate workspace. Dual monitors, labeled archives, a system that reflected not just efficiency but ownership. And with each adjustment, the space began to feel less like somewhere I had retreated to and more like somewhere I had built. I upgraded my chair, replaced the unstable desk, and finally bought a proper filing cabinet. Small decisions that carried a weight far beyond their cost because they were made without negotiation, without justification, without needing to be approved. At night, the silence no longer pressed against me. It settled around me. There was still loneliness. Still the occasional instinct to reach for a voice that had once defined my sense of belonging, but it no longer dictated my actions, no longer pulled me backward into patterns I had spent years mistaking for connection. I saw the missed calls from Mom, the short, carefully worded messages from Dad, and the occasional check-in from Caleb that felt more like obligation than concern, and for the first time, I understood that distance was not loss. It was clarity. The second major turning point came unexpectedly. A regional legal conference in Chicago had requested a last-minute speaker to present on archival reconstruction in contested inheritance cases, and one of the senior partners I had worked with submitted my name without asking first, assuming I would either accept or decline without hesitation. When the email arrived, outlining the opportunity, the audience, and the expectations, I felt a brief, familiar flicker of doubt, the same instinct that had once kept me in the background. But it didn't last. I accepted. The conference hall was larger than I had anticipated, filled with attorneys, consultants, and analysts whose experience, on paper, exceeded mine. And as I stood behind the podium, adjusting the microphone, I realized that for years I had been preparing for this exact moment without ever being told it would come. I spoke clearly, not quickly, walking them through real case structures, demonstrating how overlooked inconsistencies could reshape entire legal outcomes. And as I moved through the presentation, I saw the shift in the room, the subtle change in attention when people stop evaluating you and start listening. Afterward, 3 firms approached me. One offered a retainer. Another proposed a partnership. The third simply said they had been looking for someone who could do exactly what I had just shown. I returned to my hotel that night, closed the door behind me, and sat down at the small desk near the window, the city lights reflecting faintly against the glass, and for a moment, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had changed. Not just the work, not just the income, but the position I now occupied in a world that had never required me to disappear in order to succeed. I thought about the funeral, the tribute, the omission, and I realized something that had not been clear to me then. They had not erased me because I lacked value. They had erased me because my value did not fit the version of the family they needed to maintain. I opened my laptop, reviewed the new offers waiting in my inbox, and began responding, not cautiously, not hesitantly, but with the same precision I had applied to every archive I had rebuilt. This time, there was no one to overwrite my name, and nothing left to take from it. The first message from Mom did not come as an apology, or even a question, but as a carefully worded invitation that arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was finalizing a case summary that would close out one of the largest contracts I had taken on to date. It was brief, composed, and unmistakably intentional, asking if I could attend a small family gathering that weekend because some extended relatives wanted to reconnect. A phrase that sounded harmless on the surface, but carried the same familiar undertone of image management I had grown up navigating. I read it once, then again, and for a moment I considered ignoring it the way I had ignored the others. But something in the timing felt different. Not urgent, but calculated, as if the invitation itself had been delayed until it could serve a purpose beyond simple reconciliation. The next message arrived less than an hour later, this time from Dad, confirming the same gathering but adding that it would mean a lot to Mom if I came. A line so precisely constructed it almost felt rehearsed, designed to shift responsibility without acknowledging what had happened. Caleb's message followed that evening. "Just come," he wrote. "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." I set my phone down slowly, the three messages forming a pattern I recognized immediately. Not because it was new, but because it was identical to every moment in the past, when something needed to be smoothed over before it became visible to anyone outside the family. The difference now was not in what they were doing, but in how clearly I could see it. The gathering was scheduled at my parents' house. Of course it was. The same house where every version of the story had always been shaped, adjusted, and presented in a way that protected them first. The same dining room where conversations never ended with resolution but with redirection. The same living room where discomfort was reframed as misunderstanding and accountability quietly disappeared. I arrived 10 minutes late, not out of hesitation, but by choice. The driveway was already full. Unfamiliar cars lined along the curb, voices drifting out from the open front door. The sound of laughter carrying a warmth that felt carefully constructed, as if the entire evening had been arranged to look effortless. As I stepped inside, conversations paused just long enough to register my presence, then resumed with a slightly altered tone. Softer, more aware, because even without context, people can sense when something unresolved enters a room. Mom crossed the space quickly, her expression bright, her arms opening in a gesture that would have looked like relief to anyone watching. And as she hugged me, I could feel the tension beneath it, the subtle stiffness that revealed this was not about closeness, but presentation. "I'm so glad you came," she said, her voice warm enough to carry across the room, making sure others heard it, anchoring the narrative before anything else could shift it. Dad followed, offering a firm nod and a measured smile, the kind he reserved for moments when he needed to appear composed without engaging too deeply. And Caleb stood near the dining table, watching the interaction with a quiet attentiveness that suggested he was tracking more than just the surface of the conversation. Dinner was served within minutes. Plates passed, glasses filled, conversations layered over one another in a rhythm that felt almost rehearsed. And for a while, nothing directly addressed the absence that had defined the weeks before, as if avoiding it long enough might dissolve it entirely. A cousin asked about my work, an aunt commented on how busy the legal field must be, and I answered calmly, not elaborating, not deflecting, simply stating facts in a way that left no room for reinterpretation. It was Dad who shifted the tone. He set his glass down halfway through the meal, his posture straightening slightly, and spoke just loud enough to draw the attention of the table without appearing abrupt. "Lenora's been doing well," he said, his voice even, almost proud, though the phrasing felt distant, as if he were describing someone he had observed rather than raised. "She's taken on some impressive cases recently." The room responded as expected. Nods, small acknowledgments, a few questions. The kind of polite interest that builds momentum for something larger. And I could feel Mom watching me from across the table, waiting, measuring, preparing. "She's always been reliable," Mom added, her tone soft, reflective, as if she were offering a long-standing truth rather than a carefully selected description. "That's something we've always valued in this family. Reliable." The word landed exactly as it always had, not as praise, but as positioning, a way of reinforcing the role I had spent years trying to step out of. Even now, even here, Caleb leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze moving between us. And then he spoke. His voice light, almost casual, but carrying just enough weight to shift the direction of the conversation. "Things got a little tense at the funeral," he said, glancing briefly at a few relatives before returning his attention to me. "But I think we all understand it was just a stressful day." There it was, not the truth, the version. The room grew quieter, not completely silent, but attentive in a way that made every word matter more than it would have in any other context. And I could feel the expectation settle in, not forced, not explicit, but present, waiting for me to confirm what had just been suggested. Mom nodded slightly, her expression composed, supportive, as if she were encouraging resolution rather than directing it. "It was an emotional time for everyone," she said gently. "And sometimes things get misunderstood." Misunderstood. The word moved through the room like a soft correction, reshaping the narrative in real time, offering everyone a version of events that required no discomfort, no accountability, no disruption. Dad looked at me then, his gaze steady, not unkind, but firm in a way that made it clear he expected alignment, not resistance. "We're all here now," he said. "That's what matters." I placed my fork down carefully, the sound barely audible against the plate, and for a brief second, I let the silence extend just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle fully into place. They had not invited me here to reconnect. They had invited me to agree, to confirm, to finalize the version of the story they had already begun to tell. I looked around the table, at the faces waiting, some curious, some cautious, some simply following the direction of the conversation without understanding its depth, and then I looked back at my family, at the quiet certainty in their expressions, the expectation that I would once again adjust the truth to fit the shape they needed. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to protect them from what came next. The silence after Caleb's last sentence did not feel accidental, but constructed, as if the entire table had been guided to that exact point so the conclusion could settle cleanly into place without resistance. I could feel the expectation moving through the room, not spoken, but understood, a quiet agreement waiting for me to confirm that everything had simply been a misunderstanding, that nothing needed to be examined more closely, that the version they had presented was the one we would all accept. I lifted my gaze slowly, not rushing the moment, not filling the space they had created for me with anything reactive. Because for the first time I understood that control did not come from speaking quickly, but from choosing exactly when to speak at all. The faces around the table were attentive now, some leaning slightly forward, others watching carefully without appearing to do so. And in that stillness, I realized that this was the moment my family had been working toward. Not reconciliation, but confirmation. "It wasn't misunderstood," I said, my voice calm, steady, carrying just far enough to reach everyone without forcing itself into the room. The shift was immediate. It did not explode. It tightened. Mom's hand paused mid-motion near her glass. Dad's expression hardened by a fraction, and Caleb leaned back slightly. Not relaxed, but alert, the casual ease he had been maintaining slipping just enough to reveal something underneath it. A few relatives exchanged quick glances, subtle, uncertain, not yet forming conclusions, but aware that the narrative they had been offered might not be complete. I let the silence follow my words, not extending it unnecessarily, but allowing it to exist long enough that it could not be dismissed as a passing comment. You removed my name, I continued, still measured, still controlled, not accusing in tone, but precise in fact. From the tribute I wrote. Mom inhaled quietly, her posture adjusting as she turned slightly toward the table, her expression softening again. The practiced version of concern returning almost instantly. Alara, she said gently, as if addressing a misunderstanding rather than a decision. We already talked about this. It was just an edit to keep things simple. Nothing was taken away from you. Nothing was taken. The phrasing settled into the space between us. And for a brief second I could see how easily it would land for anyone who had not lived inside the pattern behind it, how reasonable it sounded when separated from the context that gave it meaning. I met her gaze without shifting. You didn't simplify it, I said quietly. You erased me. The words did not rise. They landed. Dad straightened in his chair, the restraint in his posture tightening into something more rigid, his voice lowering again, but no longer neutral. This is not appropriate, he said, his tone carrying the weight of authority he had relied on for decades. We are not going to dissect family decisions in front of everyone. There it was again. Not denial. Containment. Caleb exhaled sharply, his patience now visibly thinning, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice no longer casual, but edged with something closer to irritation. You're making this into something it's not, he said. No one was trying to hurt you. I looked at him, holding his gaze longer than I ever had before. Not challenging, not aggressive, simply present in a way that left no space for deflection. You didn't need to try, I replied. A quiet ripple moved through the table, subtle but undeniable, as if something unspoken had finally taken shape in a way that could not be ignored. An aunt shifted in her seat. A cousin looked down at their plate. And for the first time, the room no longer felt aligned around my family's version of events. Mom placed her glass down carefully, her composure tightening again. But this time there was a strain beneath it, a slight loss of the effortless control she had maintained at the beginning of the evening. We are your family, she said, her voice still soft, but now carrying an edge of insistence. We have always been here for you. The sentence might have held weight once. Now it felt incomplete. You've been here, I said, my tone even. Not raised, not emotional, but grounded in something far more stable than either of us had expected. Just not for me. The distinction settled into the room with a clarity that required no explanation. And for a moment, no one spoke. Not because they agreed, but because they could not immediately reshape what had just been said into something easier to accept. Dad's expression hardened further, the line of his jaw tightening as he leaned back slightly, reassessing, recalibrating, the situation no longer following the path he had anticipated. What exactly do you want from this? He asked, his voice controlled, but no longer confident in its direction. It was a fair question. For years, I would have answered it with something that made sense to them. Something that fit within the boundaries they had set. Something that allowed the system to continue functioning without disruption. This time I didn't. I don't want anything from this, I said. The answer shifted the balance immediately, not dramatically, but decisively, because it removed the leverage they had always relied on, the assumption that I was still waiting for something they could choose to give or withhold. Caleb frowned slightly, confusion flickering across his face before it settled into something more guarded. Then why are you doing this? He asked. I held his gaze for a second, then let my attention move briefly around the table, taking in the room, the people, the setting that had once defined so much of my life, and I realized that the answer was simpler than any explanation I could have given before. Because I'm not going to pretend anymore, I said. The words were not loud, but they ended something. Completely. I reached for my bag. Not abruptly. Not as a reaction, but as a decision. And as I stood up from the table, I felt the weight of their expectations fall away in a way that was almost imperceptible. yet entirely irreversible. No one stopped me. Not this time. The drive back that night felt different from any other drive I had taken after leaving that house. Not because the road had changed, but because I had. The streets were quiet, the city lights stretching in long reflections across the windshield. And for the first time, I was not replaying the conversation, not rewriting my words, not questioning whether I had said too much or too little, because there was nothing left to adjust. I had not lost anything in that room. I had ended something. When I stepped into my apartment, the air felt still, but not empty. And as I set my bag down on the table, I noticed the folded copy of the original tribute still inside, the paper that had once represented what had been taken from me now carrying a different meaning entirely. I unfolded it slowly, reading the final line where my name stood clearly, unedited, unchanged. And I realized that for so long, I had been waiting for my family to acknowledge something they had already decided to deny. I didn't need them to restore it. I had never actually lost it. Over the next few weeks, the messages slowed. Mom called less often, her texts shorter, more cautious, as if she were testing whether the space between us would eventually close on its own. Dad stopped trying to mediate entirely, his silence more revealing than anything he had said before. And Caleb sent one final message that simply read, "Let me know if you ever want to talk." A sentence that felt less like an invitation and more like an acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted beyond repair. I did not respond. Not out of anger, out of clarity. My work continued to expand in ways that felt less like sudden success and more like alignment. Each project reinforcing a sense of direction I had never been allowed to follow without interruption. I moved into a larger apartment 3 months later, not as an upgrade to prove anything, but because I needed the space to support what I was building. And as I set up my new office, arranging files, calibrating systems, and placing each element exactly where it belonged, I felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition and everything to do with ownership. One afternoon, while organizing a newly acquired estate archive, I came across a handwritten letter tucked between official documents, its edges worn, its ink slightly faded, and as I read it, I realized it had been written by someone documenting a life that had nearly been forgotten. A name that had almost disappeared because no one had taken the time to preserve it. The letter was simple, not dramatic, not extraordinary, but it carried a weight that felt familiar. A quiet insistence that being remembered was not about being chosen by others, but about existing fully enough that your presence could not be erased without consequence. I placed the letter back into its proper place, labeled it carefully, and continued working, aware in a way I had never been before that what I did, both professionally and personally, was not about proving my worth to anyone who had refused to see it. It was about refusing to disappear. Months later, I returned to the same funeral home, not for family but for a client, walking through the same doors, past the same foyer, the same polished wood and soft lighting, but this time, I was not carrying grief shaped by obligation or silence shaped by expectation. I was there to ensure that every detail, every name, every part of a life was represented accurately, completely, without distortion. And as I reviewed the final display with the client, I felt a quiet certainty settle into place. No one was missing, and neither was I. I left the building without looking back, stepping into the afternoon light with a clarity that no longer depended on where I had come from or who had once defined me. Because the truth had already been established, not in a confrontation, not in a correction, but in the simple, undeniable fact of how I chose to live moving forward. I no longer needed my family to define my worth.